She grew up behind gilded walls, trained to smile at treaties that were lies, betrothed since childhood to an alpha king whose face she'd never seen. Peace, they promised. Sacrifice for the greater good. But the war never ended. Meanwhile, he grew up on blood-soaked battlefields, burying friends season after season, fighting enemies his kingdom swore deserved to die. Duty became armor. Honor became chains. He was shaped to lead soldiers into wars he could not stop, could not question. She chose to stop believing the propaganda, not through rebellion spoken aloud, but through action taken in shadow, stealing enemy armor to see the truth her own people were hiding. He entered that battlefield exhausted by endless war, expecting another faceless enemy to strike down. But fate destroys certainty the moment you depend on it. When the Alpha King finally wounded the enemy soldier and lifted the helmet to confirm death, everything he knew shattered. It was her, his betrothed, and she was his mate. If you want to see how this impossible love survives war, conspiracy, and betrayal, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss what happens next. And while you're here, comment below and let me know where you're watching from. I love seeing this community grow across the world. Now, let's go back to where it all began. The documents had been hidden in plain sight, filed under trade agreements in her father's private study where no curious daughter would think to look. But Alara had learned long ago that the most dangerous secrets wore the most boring disguises. She ran her fingers over the wax seal of her kingdom's council, already broken, already read by people who profited from every death on both sides of the border. Her hands trembled not with fear, but with rage so pure it threatened to shift her into wolf form right there in the moonlit study. The letter was dated 3 weeks before the enemy attack on Millbrook, the village massacre that had ended the last peace negotiations, that had justified another year of bloodshed, that had delayed her wedding to King Darius yet again. Only it wasn't an enemy attack. The orders had come from within her own kingdom. Orchestrated, calculated, profitable. Proceed with Operation Millbrook as planned. Ensure evidence points to Fenrath forces. The betrothal must be delayed until our military contracts are secured. High Council. Alara felt her wolf surge beneath her skin, golden eyes flaring in the darkened room. 19 years of diplomatic training shattered like glass. Every smile she'd given at treaty dinners. Every time she'd defended her kingdom's righteousness. Every moment she'd believed the story that she was being sacrificed for peace. Lies. All of it. The sound of guards changing posts in the hallway outside snapped her back to reality. She couldn't confront her father. Not directly. He was either complicit in the conspiracy or so thoroughly manipulated that the truth would destroy him. Either way, confronting him would get her locked away or worse, silenced permanently. She needed proof that couldn't be dismissed. Proof from the battlefield itself. Proof that would force both kingdoms to see what their councils had done. Alara's gaze fell on the window overlooking the military courtyard below. Even at this late hour, soldiers were mobilizing. She'd heard the rumors at dinner, another skirmish brewing at the border. Fenratha's army, supposedly advancing. Another convenient excuse for another battle. Her decision crystallized like ice forming over water. She would go to that battlefield. Not as Lady Alara, betrothed princess and political pawn. Not as the obedient bride waiting in her tower for a war to end. She would go as a soldier, in stolen armor, with her face hidden beneath a helmet, and she would see the truth they'd been hiding from her since childhood. The armor room was 3 floors below, guarded by young soldiers who believed she was a delicate noblewoman who'd never touched a weapon. They had no idea about the secret training sessions in abandoned warehouses, the sympathetic guards who taught her to fight because they'd seen the fire in her eyes and understood that some cages were made of expectations rather than iron. Alara folded the damning letter and tucked it inside her bodice. Then she slipped out of her father's study and into the shadows of the castle she'd spent 22 years learning to navigate unseen. Now or never. The steel breastplate was heavier than Alara had expected. She adjusted the pauldron on her left shoulder for the 3rd time, feeling the unfamiliar weight pressing against her collarbone. The stolen armor hadn't been forged for her frame. It had been made for a male soldier, probably dead now or discharged, forgotten in the back of the equipment storage where damaged gear went to be repaired and rarely was. The metal plates shifted with every movement, creating small sounds that made her freeze mid-motion, heart hammering, certain someone would hear. No one did. The chaos of pre-dawn mobilization was the perfect cover. Soldiers flooded the courtyard like ants from a disturbed nest, shouting orders, checking weapons, tightening saddle girths on restless horses. News had arrived with a sunrise courier. Enemy forces, Darius's forces, were moving toward a contested border position. Her father's generals had ordered immediate deployment. Every available soldier would march within the hour. And Alara, who was supposed to be sleeping peacefully in her chambers after another night of diplomatic dinners and forced smiles, had seen the opportunity open like a door she'd been waiting her whole life to walk through. She finished fastening the leather straps that held the armor pieces together, fingers trembling but determined. 22 years living in that beautiful prison. 22 years being shaped, groomed, controlled. Told to be graceful when she wanted to be strong. Told to be silent when she wanted to scream. Pretending to be the perfect political bride while the wolf inside her snarled against the cage of expectations. Because that was what she was, what everyone in both kingdoms was, werewolves. Creatures caught between two forms, two natures. Full transformation didn't come until after the 18th year, when the inner wolf finally matured and fused permanently with human consciousness. Alara had gone through her first shift 3 years ago, feeling her bones break and remake themselves, feeling the wolf truly awaken inside her. Wild, powerful, free in ways her human form could never be within the castle walls. But even with her wolf fully emerged, even with that primal strength coiled beneath her skin, she was still trapped, still told where to go, who to marry, how to smile while her world burned around her. Not anymore. Her father's voice echoed in her memory, cold and dismissive as always. The wedding will proceed once the current conflict stabilizes. You'll marry King Darius and finally serve a useful purpose for this kingdom. Until then, stay in your chambers and stay out of the way. Stay out of the way. As if she were furniture. As if her betrothal wasn't the excuse they used every time they needed to justify another delay, another battle, another year of profitable war. The wolf growled low in her chest, scraping at her ribs, demanding the freedom to hunt, to fight, to choose her own path instead of following the one carved out by councils and conspiracies. Alara caught her reflection in a polished shield hanging on the storage room wall. A warrior stared back at her where there had once been a princess in silk and jewels. Blonde hair, usually worn in the elaborate styles her father preferred because they made her look appropriately feminine, was now braided tight against her skull, ready to disappear beneath a helmet. Golden eyes that usually smiled demurely at treaty dinners now burned with determination. She picked up the sword leaning against the wall, feeling its familiar weight settle into her hand. This, at least, she knew. She'd convinced sympathetic guards to train her in secret over the years, in forgotten corners of the practice yards, in abandoned buildings beyond the castle grounds, anywhere she could learn to fight without being discovered. Because noble women didn't fight. Especially not princesses betrothed to foreign kings. But Alara had never been good at doing what she was supposed to do. She slid the blade into the scabbard at her hip, pulled the helmet over her head, and stepped out of the storage room into the organized chaos of the military courtyard. No one looked twice at one more soldier joining the ranks. No one questioned the figure in ill-fitting armor who kept to the edges of formations and avoided direct conversation. And when the battalion marched out through the castle gates toward the border where King Darius and his army waited, Alara marched with them, invisible, anonymous, and finally free to seek the truth that had been hidden from her for 22 years. Even if that truth destroyed everything she thought she knew. Even if it meant facing the man she was supposed to marry on a battlefield instead of at an altar. The crystal chandelier above the dining hall cast fractured light across silver platters and political smiles. Alara had perfected the art of looking engaged while her mind wandered elsewhere, a survival skill developed over years of tedious diplomatic dinners where her presence was decorative rather than necessary. Tonight's affair honored visiting merchants from the Northern Territories, Men whose wealth funded her father's military campaigns and who spoke in careful euphemisms about supply contracts and resource allocation. She was reaching for her wine glass when she heard it. Millbrook was executed flawlessly. The voice belonged to Lord Ashford, her father's senior military advisor, drifting from the partially open door to the adjacent council chamber. Alara's hand froze halfway to the glass. Millbrook. The border village massacred 3 weeks ago. The attack that had ended the latest peace negotiations. The reason her wedding to King Darius had been postponed yet again. The evidence trail points directly to Fenrath forces as planned. Another voice, Lord Corbin from the Treasury. The king has already authorized increased military spending. Our contractors are quite pleased. Alara's wolf stirred beneath her skin, sensing danger before her conscious mind fully processed what she was hearing. She set down her fork with deliberate care, every movement controlled while her heart began to hammer against her ribs. And the betrothal? Her father's voice now, unmistakable in its cold authority. Delayed indefinitely, Your Majesty, just as intended. Peace is far less profitable than war, and that marriage would have complicated our quarterly projections significantly. The conversation continued, but Alara heard nothing past the roaring in her ears. Her fingers gripped the edge of the table, nails digging into expensive mahogany. Millbrook hadn't been an enemy attack. It had been orchestrated, planned, profitable. And her betrothal, the marriage she'd been told since childhood would end the war and save countless lives, was nothing but theater to keep populations compliant while councils grew rich on bloodshed. She stood abruptly, drawing curious glances from nearby nobles. "Forgive me," she murmured with a practiced smile that felt like glass cutting her face. "I'm not feeling well." No one tried to stop her as she left. Why would they? She was just the betrothed princess, a political pawn moved across the board by men who saw her as inventory rather than intellect. Her chambers felt suffocating. Alara paced like her wolf form, back and forth across plush carpets that suddenly seemed woven from lies. She needed proof. Needed something undeniable that couldn't be dismissed as a young woman's overactive imagination or emotional instability. The men in that council chamber would never confess willingly, and confronting her father directly would accomplish nothing except her own imprisonment or worse. The castle bells chimed midnight before she made her decision. Her father's private study sat in the east wing, 3 floors above the staterooms and conveniently isolated from prying eyes. Alara had spent her childhood in this castle, knew every servant passage and forgotten corridor. She'd learned to move silently through these halls the same way she'd learned to smile at diplomatic functions, out of necessity for survival in a world that expected her compliance. The study door was locked, but she'd stolen the spare key months ago during one of her father's extended military inspections. Her hands trembled as she slipped inside, closing the door behind her with barely a whisper of sound. Moonlight filtered through tall windows, illuminating mahogany furniture and walls lined with books her father had never read. He preferred maps and military reports to literature, strategy over philosophy. The filing cabinets stood against the far wall, organized with military precision. She started with trade agreements, the most boring category imaginable, exactly where dangerous secrets would hide. Her fingers moved through folders with practiced speed, reading document headers by moonlight until she found it. Operation Millbrook. Tactical Implementation Plan. The words blurred as she read. Orders for her own kingdom soldiers to dress in Fenrath uniforms. Instructions for staging the attack during market hours to maximize civilian casualties. Budgetary projections showing increased military spending and contractor profits following the incident. And signatures at the bottom. Lord Ashford, Lord Corbin, and a dozen other names she recognized from her father's inner council. Her father's signature wasn't there, but his seal authenticated the document's distribution. Alara's vision went white at the edges. The wolf inside her surged, demanding she shift, demanding she tear something apart with claws and teeth. She forced it down through sheer willpower, breathing through her nose until the transformation urge passed. Shifting now would mean discovery, and discovery would mean everything she'd learned would die with her in a cell somewhere. She kept searching, pulling document after document. The conspiracy wasn't isolated to Millbrook. It went back years. Orchestrated border skirmishes, sabotaged peace negotiations, falsified intelligence reports blaming Darius's kingdom for atrocities they'd never committed. Every time her wedding date had been set, some convenient crisis would emerge to delay it. Every treaty discussion had been undermined by events that originated not from enemy forces, but from within her own kingdom's war machine. Her betrothal had always been a performance. The promise of peace through marriage kept populations hopeful enough to tolerate continued war, while the deliberate delays kept military funding flowing into the pockets of men who profited from prolonged conflict. She found her father's personal correspondence in the bottom drawer, letters written in his own hand. They revealed a man who'd started ignorant, who'd trusted his advisors absolutely, who'd been fed carefully constructed lies until he believed them as truth. He wasn't the architect of this conspiracy. He was its most useful tool, a king manipulated into authorizing atrocities he thought were defensive necessities. The realization didn't absolve him. It only made the tragedy more complete. Alara sat back on her heels, surrounded by evidence of systematic corruption, and understood with devastating clarity that she couldn't confront her father. He'd either refuse to believe his most trusted advisors were lying, or he'd be forced to admit complicity in crimes that warranted execution. Either way, she'd be silenced, locked away for her own protection, married off quickly to prevent further investigation, or simply disappeared by conspirators who'd already proven they'd murder entire villages to maintain their profits. She needed proof from the battlefield itself. Proof that Fenrath soldiers weren't the monsters they'd been portrayed as. Proof that would force both kingdoms to see what their councils had done. The Armor Museum was 2 floors below, a glorified storage room for damaged equipment waiting for repair that rarely came. Alara had explored it years ago during one of her childhood rebellions, back when she'd believed learning to fight could somehow give her control over her own fate. She'd been naive then, thinking personal strength mattered in a world where power came from politics rather than prowess. But now her secret training sessions with sympathetic guards, young soldiers who taught her sword work in forgotten corners because they'd seen something in her eyes worth nurturing, might actually save her life. She carefully returned the documents to their folders, memorizing names and dates and operation codes. Then she slipped from her father's study as silently as she'd entered, descended through servant passages to the Armor Museum, and began selecting pieces that might fit her frame well enough to pass inspection. The breastplate was too large. The pauldrons didn't quite align. But wars were chaotic, and soldiers wore whatever armor they could salvage. No one would look closely at one more figure in ill-fitting gear. By the time dawn light crept through the museum windows, Alara had made her choice. She would join the battalion marching to the border. She would see Darius's forces with her own eyes. She would gather the truth her kingdom's council had hidden behind orchestrated massacres and manufactured crises. And if that truth destroyed everything she'd been raised to believe, then so be it. Better to live in harsh reality than comfortable lies. The Fenrath battalion camped 3 miles beyond the contested border, close enough to neutral territory that Alara could slip in among the supply wagons without drawing immediate suspicion. She timed her arrival for dusk, when exhausted soldiers cared more about food and rest than scrutinizing a lone figure in battered armor. "You look lost." The voice came from her left, a woman about Alara's age, dark-haired and sharp-eyed, wearing the leather jerkin of a field medic. "New transfer." Alara nodded, keeping her helmet angled to shadow her face. She'd practiced lowering her voice to a rougher register. "From the southern garrison." The medic studied her for a moment that stretched too long, then shrugged. "Fine 3rd Company. They lost 2 soldiers last week and haven't received replacements yet. Captain Varen will take anyone with working arms and legs." She jerked her thumb toward a cluster of tents marked with blue pennants before moving on. Alara had expected interrogation, suspicion, tests of loyalty. Instead, she found weary acceptance. No one questioned another body to fill gaps in undermanned units. The realization settled uncomfortably in her chest. Darius's army wasn't the well-funded war machine her kingdom's propaganda portrayed. These were conscripts and volunteers stretched thin across too many borders, making do with whatever reinforcements arrived. Third Company's camp smelled of wood smoke and horse sweat. Soldiers sat in small groups around fires, cleaning weapons, mending gear, speaking in low tones that carried the particular exhaustion of people who'd seen too much death too young. Alara spotted Captain Varen immediately, a broad-shouldered man with gray threading his beard, organizing watch rotations with the calm efficiency of someone who'd done this 1,000 times before. She approached, spine straight despite the armor's weight. "Captain, I'm told you need soldiers." Varen looked up from his duty roster, assessing her with the quick evaluation of a career military officer. His gaze lingered on the ill-fitting armor, but he asked no questions about its origins. "Can you hold formation and follow orders?" "Yes, sir." "Good enough." He scrawled something on his roster. "Find a bedroll. We march at dawn toward the Clearwater Crossing. Intel says your people are moving to fortify the eastern approach." He paused, catching himself. "Our people, takes some getting used to transfers." Alara's throat tightened at the casual misidentification, but she only nodded and moved toward the supply tent. "Your people." He meant her kingdom's forces, the army she'd grown up believing were defenders of righteousness. Now she'd fight against them disguised as the enemy they'd taught her to hate. She claimed a bedroll near two young soldiers arguing quietly over a letter. The younger one, barely 18 if Alara judged correctly, was struggling with spelling. "It's truly, not truly," his companion said, pointing at the parchment. "Your mother will think they didn't teach you letters." "I had 2 seasons of schooling before conscription," the younger soldier shot back. "And Ma knows I'm better with a plow than a pen." Despite his defensive tone, he made the correction carefully. Alara watched them from beneath her helmet's shadow, these supposed barbarians who wrote letters home to worried mothers. She'd been told Fenrath soldiers were brutes who lived for violence, who celebrated civilian casualties, who'd murder prisoners without hesitation. These boys looked like the young men from her own kingdom's villages, scared, homesick, trying to survive circumstances beyond her control. The propaganda she'd swallowed her entire life began to curdle in her stomach. That night, she barely slept. Unfamiliar sounds surrounded her, the quiet breathing of soldiers, the distant howl of wolves that might have been werewolves in their true form, the snap of campfire embers dying to ash. Her wolf remained restless beneath her skin, uncertain whether these people represented threat or something more complicated. Dawn brought chaos. Scouts returned with news that her kingdom's forces were indeed advancing toward Clearwater Crossing, moving faster than expected. Captain Varen barked orders with practiced urgency: form ranks, check weapons, prepare for engagement. Alara's hands moved automatically through the preparations her secret training had drilled into muscle memory, even as her mind screamed that she was about to fight her own people. The march to Clearwater took 3 hours. Alara positioned herself in the middle ranks where mistakes would be less visible, surrounded by soldiers whose names she didn't know and whose lives she might be responsible for ending. The forest thinned as they approached the river crossing, revealing open ground that offered no cover and invited slaughter. Her kingdom's forces were already there, banners bright against morning sky, forming defensive positions along the western bank. Alara recognized the insignia, Duke Morland's regiment, one of her father's most loyal units. Men she'd seen at castle functions, whose families served in her father's court, now raising weapons against the battalion she stood among. Captain Varen's voice cut through her spiraling thoughts. "Shields up. Advance by rows." The first arrows fell like deadly rain. Combat was nothing like training. Training had rules, controlled movements, instructors who stopped you before real harm occurred. This was immediate chaos. The clash of metal on metal, screams of wounded, the wet sound of blades finding flesh. Alara's wolf surged instinctively, lending supernatural speed to her movements as she blocked a strike aimed at her neck, countering with a thrust that found the gap in her opponent's armor. The soldier fell. Blood spread across his tunic. He looked maybe 25, gasping for air that wouldn't come, eyes wide with surprise and fear and the particular knowledge that death had arrived ahead of schedule. Alara stumbled backward, while rising. She'd trained with swords, but never imagined the reality. The weight of a life ending because of her actions, the way a human body became just meat and blood when the soul departed. Stay in formation. Someone shoved her back into line. The battle continued whether she participated or not. She fought because stopping meant dying. Her training took over, body moving through defensive patterns while her mind tried to process the horror surrounding her. She witnessed Captain Varen dragging a wounded soldier to safety despite enemy fire. Watched the young letter writer fall with an arrow through his thigh, crying out for his mother. Saw a Fenrath medic crawling between corpses from both sides, treating wounds without asking whose colors the bleeding soldier wore. The propaganda had never mentioned that healers served everyone. Had never shown her that the enemy cried the same way when injured, died the same way when struck down, mourned the same way when friends fell beside them. The skirmish lasted less than an hour but felt like days. When horns finally signaled withdrawal on both sides, neither army willing to commit to full engagement over a minor river crossing, Alara collapsed against a tree, hands shaking so violently she couldn't remove her helmet. Around her, Fenrath soldiers tended wounded, counted dead, spoke names of fallen comrades with the reverent grief of people who'd lost family. Duke Morland's forces retreated across the river, carrying their own casualties, leaving corpses that would be collected under truce flags once both sides established temporary ceasefire. First real fight. The medic from the previous night crouched beside Alara, offering a water skin. Blood stained her hands, whose blood, impossible to determine. Alara managed a nod, not trusting her voice. Gets easier. Or you get harder. Hard to tell which. The medic's expression held no judgment, only the weary understanding of someone who'd seen countless soldiers confront war's reality for the first time. You did well, holding your position. Better than most. She moved on to the next soldier, leaving Alara alone with the truth she could no longer deny. These weren't monsters. They were people, complex, flawed, human people fighting the same war from different sides of manufactured divisions. And somewhere in the camps beyond that river, her own kingdom soldiers were having identical conversations, mourning identical losses, believing they fought for righteousness against barbaric enemies. The conspiracy her father's council had maintained for years wasn't just about profit. It was about perpetuating a lie so enormous that entire kingdoms had structured their identities around it. And that lie required constant maintenance through orchestrated attacks and propaganda that dehumanized the enemy enough to make killing them palatable. Alara looked at the bodies awaiting collection and understood with devastating clarity that proof of conspiracy wouldn't be enough. She needed to survive long enough to show both kingdoms what she'd learned today, that the real enemy wasn't across the border. It was in the council chambers where men profited from keeping populations afraid enough to tolerate endless war. First, though, she needed to survive the next battle, and the one after that, and somehow avoid dying before she could expose the truth that was worth all this blood. The attack came 3 days after Clearwater, when Third Company had been reassigned to reinforce a critical supply route. Intelligence reported a major push from Alara's kingdom, not a skirmish this time, but a coordinated assault with multiple battalions converging on a strategic choke point that would cut Fenrath's northern forces off from reinforcements. Alara had stopped questioning the intelligence. She'd seen enough to know both sides fought with legitimate tactical concerns, responding to real threats rather than the manufactured aggression her kingdom's propaganda portrayed. The war was self-sustaining now, each side's defensive actions interpreted as offensive aggression by the other, feeding cycles of retaliation that benefited only those who profited from continued conflict. The battlefield was a narrow valley between forested ridges, terrible ground that funneled soldiers into killing zones with limited retreat options. Captain Varen positioned Third Company on the left flank, anchoring against a rocky outcrop that provided minimal cover. Alara checked her borrowed sword for the 10th time, testing the grip that had become familiar through necessity rather than comfort. Stay close to the line, the soldier beside her muttered. Don't get separated. Valley fights turn into chaos fast. Before Alara could respond, horns blasted from the ridge above. Her kingdom's forces poured down the slopes like an avalanche, banners streaming, war cries echoing off stone. The coordinated assault she'd been warned about, executed with the precision of Duke Morland's professional soldiers rather than conscripted farmers. Third Company met them with desperate determination born of fighting on disadvantageous ground. Alara lost track of time in the chaos, blocking strikes, countering when openings appeared, trying not to think about the faces behind enemy helmets that might belong to castle guards she'd known since childhood. Her wolf strained against her control, wanting to shift into the more lethal form, but transformation would reveal her identity instantly. Female werewolves had distinctive colorings, and a golden-furred wolf among Fenratha's darker-coated soldiers would draw immediate attention. She was forced steadily backward, separated from her unit by the press of combat. A soldier lunged at her with a spear. She sidestepped, her counterstrike glancing off his shoulder guard. Another attacked from her blind side. She barely managed to deflect the blow, the impact jarring her arms hard enough to numb her fingers. Then he appeared. Alara didn't need formal portraits to recognize Darius. She knew him the way prey knows predator. Instant, visceral awareness of facing something far more dangerous than anything she'd encountered before. He moved through combat like water flowing downhill, every motion economical and lethal, cutting through Fenrath soldiers with the brutal efficiency of someone who'd spent decades perfecting the art of killing. Long dark hair whipped as he turned, golden eyes blazing with contained fury behind his helmet's edge, battle-scarred hands wielding his sword like it was an extension of his body rather than a separate weapon. He was magnificent and terrifying, and he was coming straight toward her. Alara's instinct screamed to run, but retreat meant exposing her back to a warrior who would strike her down before she managed 3 steps. She set her stance, raising her sword in a defensive position her training instructor would have approved of, knowing even as she did that it wouldn't be enough. Darius attacked without hesitation. His blade came at her in a high arc that forced her guard up, then reversed into a low sweep that nearly took her legs. She barely avoided the strike, stumbling backward over uneven ground. He pressed the advantage relentlessly, each attack flowing into the next with practiced precision that left her scrambling to defend rather than counter. She lasted longer than she should have, her secret training providing just enough skill to avoid immediate death. But Darius had been fighting since before she was born, and exhaustion was already slowing her reactions. When his blade finally found the gap between her breastplate and pauldron, sliding through damaged armor rings that hadn't been properly repaired, the pain was almost a relief. At least the impossible fight was over. Alara collapsed, pressure building in her side where blood welled hot and fast. The sounds of battle receded to a distant roar. She tried to breathe and tasted copper. Tried to move and found her body unresponsive. Above her, Darius approached with the careful steps of a warrior confirming a kill, sword still raised in case she proved more dangerous than she appeared. He knelt beside her, reaching for her helmet with blood-stained fingers. The practical gesture of a commander checking whether the fallen enemy might provide intelligence before they died. His hand closed on the helmet's edge, pulling it free. Blonde hair spilled across mud and stones. Golden eyes met his, barely focused, fighting to maintain consciousness long enough to understand what was happening. The mate bond struck like lightning given physical form. Alara felt it tear through her, not painful but overwhelming, a recognition so deep it existed below conscious thought, below identity, below everything except the fundamental awareness that this soul belongs with mine. Her wolf howled inside her chest, not in fear or aggression, but in absolute certainty.
Mate. Hers.
The other half of something she hadn't known was incomplete until this moment. Darius's expression shattered. She watched his eyes go wide, watched the color drain from his face, watched his hand freeze where it touched her throat to check for pulse. The moment his skin met hers, the bond sealed completely, ancient magic woven into werewolf bloodlines that couldn't be denied or dismissed, that chose mates without regard for politics or kingdoms or the convenient timing of those who thought themselves in control. His wolf was roaring. She couldn't hear it, But she could see the effect. His entire body went rigid, muscles locked in conflict between instinct demanding he protect her and reality insisting she was the enemy. Horror dawned in his golden eyes as he processed what had just happened.
Mate.
Enemy.
Both.
Impossible. Alara tried to speak, tried to explain she wasn't who he thought she was, but blood bubbled at her lips instead of words. The wound in her side was serious, possibly fatal, without immediate treatment. Her vision narrowed to a tunnel with Darius's face at the center, surrounded by encroaching darkness. She saw the moment recognition struck him beyond the mate bond. Saw his eyes widen further as he truly looked at her face, not just another enemy soldier, but her. Lady Alara.
His betrothed.
The woman he'd exchanged formal portraits with, whose marriage to him was supposed to end the war, who should have been safe in her father's castle preparing for a wedding rather than dying on a battlefield in stolen armor. What? His voice cracked. Why are you? The question dissolved into incoherence. How could he ask why his fiancée was fighting in his enemy's ranks? Why she wore their armor, carried their weapons, shed their blood? The situation made no sense through any logical framework, yet the mate bond didn't care about sense. It simply was undeniable and absolute. Alara felt consciousness slipping like water through cupped hands. She tried to hold on to awareness, tried to stay present long enough to tell him about the conspiracy, about the documents in her father's study, about why she'd infiltrated his army. But her body had reached its limits. Blood loss and shock were dragging her under despite her will to resist. The last thing she registered before darkness claimed her completely was Darius's hands pressing against her wound, trying to slow the bleeding, and his voice, ragged with emotions she couldn't name, shouting for a medic. Not calling for soldiers to finish off a wounded enemy, but demanding medical aid with the desperate urgency of someone trying to save the most important person in their world. Because that's what the mate bond had made her. In the space between one heartbeat and the next, she'd gone from enemy combatant to the other half of his soul. And he had no idea how to reconcile those two impossible truths. Neither did she. Alara woke to the smell of medicinal herbs and the low murmur of voices arguing just beyond her hearing. Pain radiated from her side, sharp enough to steal breath, but the wound had been cleaned and stitched with competent efficiency. She was alive, which surprised her more than anything else. Enemy soldiers wounded on battlefields rarely received medical attention beyond a mercy killing. She opened her eyes to canvas overhead, a medical tent then not a cell. Soft light filtered through fabric walls, suggesting either dawn or dusk. Her armor had been removed, replaced with a rough cotton shirt that hung loose on her frame. When she tried to sit up, agony lanced through her torso and forced her back down with a gasp she couldn't quite suppress. "Don't move." His voice came from the shadows to her left, rough and commanding. "The stitches will tear." Darius stepped into her field of vision, and the mate bond flared like touching bare skin to flame. Alara felt it in her chest, her stomach, the base of her spine. Everywhere at once and impossible to ignore. Her wolf stirred weakly, still recovering from blood loss, but alert enough to recognize him.
Mate. Safe. Ours.
None of those things were true, but instinct didn't care about political reality. He looked worse than she felt. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, jaw tight with tension, still wearing blood-stained armor that suggested he hadn't rested since carrying her off the battlefield. His golden eyes tracked her with unnerving intensity, the predatory focus of an alpha who'd found something that both fascinated and threatened him in equal measure. "You're awake." Not a question, just flat acknowledgement. He remained at a careful distance, as if proximity might trigger something neither of them could control. "The healers said you'd survive." The wound missed vital organs. Alara's throat felt like sandpaper. Water. He hesitated, clearly warring with himself over whether providing comfort to an enemy combatant constituted weakness. The mate bond won. He crossed to a small table, poured water from a clay pitcher, and brought it to her, though he didn't help her drink, just set it within reach, and stepped back immediately. She managed to prop herself up enough to sip without drowning, each movement sending fresh agony through her side. The water was cool and clean, better than anything she'd tasted in days of hard marching. When she'd drunk enough to ease the worst of her thirst, she met his eyes directly. "Thank you." "Don't." The word came sharp as a blade. "Don't thank me for doing what every part of my being is screaming at me to do, as if I had a choice in the matter."
The mate bond, then.
He felt it as strongly as she did, that pull toward each other that made logical decision-making nearly impossible. Alara had read about mate bonds in her tutor's lessons, the ancient magic that occasionally linked werewolf souls with perfect compatibility. Rare enough to be legendary, powerful enough to override reason, and apparently indifferent to inconvenient circumstances like wars and opposing loyalties. "You could have let me die on the field," she said quietly.
No.
His expression twisted with something between anger and anguish. "I couldn't. Believe me, I tried to convince myself to walk away. To let nature take its course. Do you have any idea what you are? What you've done?" He paced like his wolf form, energy contained barely beneath human skin. "I should be interrogating you. My commanders expect me to extract intelligence about enemy troop movements, supply lines, strategic objectives. Instead, I'm standing here watching you breathe and feeling grateful you're alive, and I don't even know your name." Alara's heart stuttered. He didn't recognize her. The formal portraits they'd exchanged had been painted years ago, stylized and idealized according to artistic convention. She'd been 19 in her portrait, soft and carefully posed to emphasize beauty over personality. Now she was 22, leaner and harder from weeks of secret combat training, face stripped of cosmetics and marked with battlefield dirt. In poor light, wearing common soldier's clothing, she was just another wounded enemy, albeit one connected to him by impossible fate. The realization bought her time, but it also complicated everything. How did she explain her presence in his enemy's army without revealing the conspiracy? If she told him about the documents, would he believe her, or assume it was enemy propaganda designed to divide his kingdom? And if she revealed her true identity, would he think their meeting was a trap orchestrated by her father's counsel? "Kara," she lied, choosing a common enough name. "I'm called Kara." "Kara." He tested the name like it might be poison. "And what were you doing fighting in my kingdom's enemy ranks? You don't have the calluses of a career soldier. Your sword work was competent, but recently learned. You're educated, I can hear it in your speech patterns. So why is someone like you dressed as a common foot soldier on a battlefield? Because I discovered my own kingdom orchestrated the attacks they blamed on yours. Because my entire life has been a performance staged by war profiteers. Because the marriage between us was never meant to succeed, just to keep populations compliant while councils grew rich on blood." She couldn't say any of that. Not yet. Not until she understood whether he was complicit in his own kingdom's corruption or as ignorant as she'd been 3 weeks ago. "I wanted to see the truth," she said instead, choosing words carefully. "To know whether the enemy was really what they told us, or whether we were all being lied to." His laugh was bitter and humorless. "And what truth did you find before I gutted you? That your soldiers write letters home to their mothers. That your medics treat wounded from both sides. That you're not the monsters we were told to hate." She held his gaze despite the pain and exhaustion. "That maybe this war serves someone's interests, but it isn't ours." Silence fell heavy between them. Darius stared at her like she'd spoken something dangerous, something that resonated with thoughts he'd been afraid to voice. Outside the tent, camp sounds continued. Soldiers moving, horses nickering, the ordinary noise of military life that provided strange comfort in its normalcy. "I should execute you." His voice had gone quiet, which somehow made the threat more terrifying than if he'd shouted. "Enemy combatant captured on the field. Standard protocol. My officers are already asking questions about why you're receiving medical treatment instead of interrogation." "But you won't." Alara pushed herself more upright despite the pain, needing to face him at something closer to equal footing. "The bond won't let you. You can feel it as clearly as I can. Don't presume to tell me what I can and cannot do." He moved closer, looming over her with the physical presence of someone accustomed to command, to obedience. But beneath the intimidation, she caught something else: desperation, confusion, the particular fear of someone whose certainty had been shattered. I've spent 3 decades learning to control my instincts, to put duty above desire. I won't be ruled by fate. She met his anger with calm she didn't feel. By the bond that decided we belong together regardless of what kingdoms we serve. You're right, it's not fair. But it's real, and fighting it will destroy us both. The words hung between them, truth neither wanted to acknowledge. The mate bond didn't care about fairness or timing or the massive complications their connection created. It simply existed, pulling them together with a force that would only strengthen over time unless severed by death. And neither of them wanted to die. Darius turned away, shoulders rigid. You'll remain here under guard until I decide what to do with you. Healers will tend your wound. You'll receive food and water. But don't mistake mercy for trust, Kara. He spoke her false name with emphasis that suggested he suspected the lie. The moment I believe you're a threat to my people, mate bond or not, I will do what duty requires. He left before she could respond, canvas flaps swishing closed behind him with the finality of a door slamming. Alara let herself collapse back against the bedding, trembling with exhaustion and something more complicated. Relief that he hadn't recognized her. Terror about what happened when he inevitably did. And beneath it all, the persistent warmth of the mate bond humming in her chest, content despite the disaster surrounding them simply because he was near and alive and hers. Even if neither of them could afford to act on it. Alara had been in the medical tent for 2 days when they brought in the new prisoners. She heard the commotion before she saw them. Raised voices, the clank of chains, soldiers protesting their rough treatment. Her guards stepped outside to investigate, leaving her alone for the first time since waking. She took the opportunity to test her mobility, slowly swinging her legs off the cot. The wound pulled but held. Another few days, and werewolf healing would close it completely. The tent flap burst open. 3 prisoners stumbled inside under armed escort, hands bound, wearing the tattered remains of her kingdom's uniforms. Alara's heart stopped. She recognized the lead soldier immediately, Captain Theron, one of her father's personal guards. A man who'd watched her grow up, who'd escorted her to diplomatic functions, who'd turned a blind eye when she'd snuck out to train with swords. Their eyes met across the tent. She watched recognition dawn on his face, watched his expression cycle through confusion, disbelief, and finally horrified understanding. Lady Alara. The name exploded from him before he could stop himself. What in the gods' names are you doing here? The entire camp seemed to go silent. Alara felt the blood drain from her face. Every soldier within earshot had frozen, staring at her with expressions ranging from shock to dawning comprehension. Lady Alara. Not a common soldier named Kara. Lady Alara, the title that marked her as nobility, as someone important enough that her presence here meant something far more significant than a simple infiltration. You know this woman? The guard's hand dropped to sword hilt, tension radiating from every line of his body. Captain Theron seemed to realize his mistake, but the damage was done. He stopped, clearly calculating how much to reveal. She's betrothed to your king. She should be in her father's castle, not. His gaze swept her borrowed clothes, the visible bandages. Not here. What happened? The guard backed toward the tent entrance. Don't move. Any of you. He disappeared through the flap, shouting for his commander. Alara met Captain Theron's eyes, shaking her head in a silent plea for him to say nothing more. But it was too late. The revelation had been made, and there was no taking it back. Darius arrived within minutes, trailed by a dozen officers whose expressions ranged from confusion to outright hostility. He looked at her with eyes gone cold and hard, the warmth she'd glimpsed during their previous conversation replaced by the flat calculation of a warrior who'd just discovered a trap. Is it true? His voice was controlled, dangerously quiet. Are you Lady Alara? My betrothed. There was no point in lying. Yes. The word fell like a stone into still water, ripples of shock spreading through everyone present. One of Darius's officers swore viciously. Another demanded immediate execution. Captain Theron struggled against his restraints, trying to reach her, shouting something about treason and her father's wrath that got him struck across the face by a guard. Darius raised a hand, silencing the chaos. Everyone out. Except her. He jerked his head toward Alara. When his officers started to protest, his wolf surfaced in his eyes, a flash of dominance that reminded everyone present exactly who commanded this army.
Out. Now.
They left reluctantly, taking the prisoners with them. Captain Theron threw her one last agonized look before being hauled away. Then she and Darius were alone with tension thick enough to choke on. You lied to me. He spoke each word with precision. Every moment since you woke. Every conversation. You let me believe you were just another soldier seeking truth when He stopped, jaw clenched. Was it a trap? Is that what this was? Get yourself wounded, so I'd feel the mate bond. Let me bring you into my camp, where you could gather intelligence. No. Alara forced herself to stand despite the pain, needing to face him as an equal. I didn't know about the mate bond. I didn't plan any of this. Then what were you planning? His control was fracturing. She could see it in the tension around his eyes, the way his hands kept clenching and releasing. Why is my betrothed fighting in my enemy's army while wearing their armor? What possible explanation? I was gathering proof of conspiracy. The words came out harder than intended. She reached for the belt they'd removed with her armor, left with her other belongings on a nearby table. Her fingers found the inner pocket where she'd sewn the most damning documents before leaving her father's castle. Proof that the war between our kingdoms is being deliberately prolonged for profit. She pulled out the folded papers, now stained with her blood but still legible. Operation Millbrook. The orchestrated attack. The budget projections. The signatures of her father's most trusted advisors. She held them out to Darius with trembling hands. He took them but didn't look down, still watching her face with that terrible intensity. These could be forgeries. They're not. She met his gaze directly, letting him see the truth she carried. I found them in my father's study 3 weeks ago. The attack on Millbrook that ended our last peace negotiation? My own kingdom orchestrated it. Blamed your forces to justify continued military spending. Our betrothal was never meant to succeed. It was theater to keep populations compliant while councils profited from blood. Convenient story. But his voice had lost some of its certainty. Read them. She gestured at the papers. Look at the signatures, the dates, the operational details. Then tell me I'm lying. Darius finally looked down. She watched his expression change as he read, watched horror and fury war across his features. When he finished the first document, he moved to the second, then the third. The silence stretched until Alara thought she might scream just to break it. This is... His voice came out rough. If this is real, it's real. She sagged against the table, exhaustion and pain catching up with her. I couldn't confront my father. Couldn't trust anyone in my kingdom. So I came here to see if your forces were really the monsters they told us you were, or if we were all being played. And the mate bond? He looked up from the documents. How convenient that we're destined mates just as you need me to believe you. The mate bond can't sustain lies. She pushed away from the table, moving closer despite the risk. You know that. You felt it. Look at me now and tell me you sense deception. He did look, golden eyes boring into hers with an intensity that felt like being stripped to her soul. The mate bond hummed between them, that ancient magic that allowed bonded pairs to sense each other's truth. She let him feel everything, her horror at discovering the conspiracy, her determination to expose it, her terror at what would happen next. Finally, he looked away. My advisors will say, these are forgeries. Enemy propaganda designed to divide us. Are they? She kept her voice gentle. Are there no similar incidents in your kingdom's history? Attacks that justified convenient policy changes? Supply contracts awarded to council members' families. His expression told her she'd struck truth. How do I know your council didn't orchestrate this entire thing? Send you here with these documents, with the mate bond as leverage. The mate bond isn't something anyone can orchestrate. She cut him off. It happens or it doesn't, beyond mortal control. And if my father's council wanted a spy in your camp, they'd have chosen someone with actual espionage training, not a frustrated noblewoman with 3 weeks of battlefield experience. Before he could respond, shouts erupted outside. Running footsteps. His second-in-command burst through the tent entrance without waiting for permission, face flushed with urgency. My lord messengers. 2 groups arrived simultaneously. The officer's gaze flickered to Alara with barely concealed hostility. One from her kingdom demanding her immediate return to face execution for treason and espionage. The other from our own capital. Your council demands you execute her as a spy and cancel the betrothal alliance immediately. Both groups are waiting for your response. The words hit like physical blows. Alara felt her knees weaken. Execution. Both kingdoms wanted her dead, her own for discovering their conspiracy, Darius's for the threat she represented to their parallel corruption. Leave us, Darius said quietly. My lord.
Leave us.
The officer retreated, clearly unhappy. When they were alone again, Darius looked at Alara with something that might have been sympathy under different circumstances. They're going to kill you, he said flatly. Both kingdoms. Unless I protect you, which would be seen as choosing you over my duty to my people. Then don't. She forced the words past her tight throat. Give me to whichever messenger arrived first. At least my death might buy you political capital.
No.
The word came swift and absolute. The mate bond won't allow it. And he stopped jaw working. And I believe you. About the conspiracy. About all of it. Which means we're both dead unless we find a way to prove it to people who profit from not believing. The poison came on the 3rd night. Alara had been moved to a more secure tent under constant guard, ostensibly for her protection but functionally a prison. She'd accepted the dinner tray without thinking, exhausted from hours of reviewing documents with Darius and his few trusted officers. The stew smelled rich and hearty, better than standard military rations. She'd raised the spoon halfway to her mouth when Darius appeared in the entrance, took one look at the tray, and knocked it from her hands with enough force to send the bowl clattering across the tent floor. Don't. He crouched beside the spilled stew, studying it with the careful attention of someone who'd learned to recognize threats. After a moment, he pulled a small vial from his belt, dripped liquid into the pooled broth. It turned black immediately. Nightshade extract. Enough to kill a werewolf within the hour. Alara's stomach turned. She'd been seconds from consuming it. Who brought the tray? That's what we're going to find out. His voice had gone cold and dangerous. He called for the guards, demanded answers. The soldier who delivered her dinner was nowhere to be found, vanished sometime in the past hour, along with his personal effects and any trail that might lead to whoever had paid him. The assassination attempts escalated from there. A crossbow bolt that missed Darius's head by inches when he stepped out of his command tent at dawn, the angle suggesting the shooter had intimate knowledge of his morning routines. Alara's armor, returned to her after her wound healed enough for limited movement, discovered to have been tampered with, leather straps nearly cut through in places that would fail during combat. A fire that started in the supply tent nearest to where she slept, spreading fast enough that only Darius's wolf-enhanced hearing detected it before the flames trapped her inside. They're in both camps, Alara said on the 5th day, studying the map spread across Darius's command table. Around them, his most trusted officers maintained careful watch. Your kingdom and mine. The conspiracy can't risk us exposing them, so they're trying to kill us before we can present evidence. Efficiently, too. Darius's beta warrior, a scarred veteran named Marcus who'd served him for 2 decades, pointed at marks on the map indicating assassination attempts. Professional work. Not random soldiers bribed into violence, but trained operatives with resources and coordination. Alara pulled another document from her collection, one she'd been studying that morning. Look at this. 3 years ago, your supply convoy was ambushed near Blackwater Pass. Blamed on raiders from my kingdom. Darius nodded. I remember. We lost 40 soldiers and 6 months of provisions. Now look at this. She laid down a second document from her father's files. My kingdom's council discussing successful disruption of enemy logistics near Blackwater Pass on the same date. But the operational details don't match standard military raids. The timing, the route, the specific supplies targeted, it reads like someone had inside intelligence about your convoy movements. Marcus leaned closer, frowning. You're suggesting they weren't raiders from your kingdom. You're suggesting hired mercenaries paid by war profiteers operating in both kingdoms. Ilera finished. Create an incident, blame it on the enemy, justify continued military spending. Both sides' councils profit from the contracts. That's speculation. One of the other officers spoke up, though he sounded uncertain rather than dismissive. It's a pattern. Darius traced connections between documents with his finger, his tactical mind processing information with the same efficiency he brought to battlefield strategy.
Here.
6 months after Blackwater Pass, a grain warehouse in Lady Ilera's territory burns. Her kingdom blames sabotage from our spies. But look, he pulled a ledger from his own records. Our intelligence reports show no covert operations in that region for the entire year. We didn't burn that warehouse. Then who did? Marcus asked, though his expression suggested he already knew. Someone who profited from the food shortage that followed, Ilera said quietly. Someone who held supply contracts and could charge inflated prices during the crisis. Let me guess, your kingdom's grain imports increased dramatically that season. Darius checked his records. His jaw tightened. Triple the usual volume. Purchased through contracts held by council members' families. The silence that followed was heavy with implications. If the conspiracy ran this deep, if it extended through both kingdoms' leadership, then exposing it would require more than documents. It would require undeniable public proof that forced accountability even from those who'd spent decades evading it. My lord. A scout entered, saluting quickly. You asked me to watch for unusual supply movements. And Darius straightened. Wagons 3 miles north. Moving through forest routes rather than main roads. I wouldn't have noticed except, the scout hesitated. They're marked with dual insignias. Ours and theirs. Half hidden under canvas, but visible when the wind shifted. The tent erupted in controlled chaos. Officers demanding details, Marcus calling for reconnaissance teams, Darius issuing rapid-fire orders. Ilera watched it unfold with grim satisfaction. Physical evidence. Tangible proof of collaboration between supposed enemies. We intercept those wagons, Darius decided. Carefully. I want prisoners who can testify, cargo we can examine, documentation if any exists. No one dies unless absolutely necessary. Dead men tell no tales. The operation launched within the hour. Ilera insisted on accompanying them despite Darius's objections, pointing out that her presence would help verify which kingdom's markings were authentic versus forged. They found the wagons exactly where the scout reported, defended by mercenaries wearing deliberately neutral colors that belonged to neither kingdom's standard uniforms. The fight was brief and brutal. Darius's forces had surprise and superior numbers. When the dust settled, they'd captured 3 mercenaries alive and seized cargo that made Ilera's blood run cold, weapons stamped with her kingdom's forge marks being transported toward Darius's territory, alongside supply manifests showing delivery to staging points that matched neither kingdom's official military installations. Weapons caches, Marcus said grimly, examining the documents. They're prepositioning equipment for future attacks that will be blamed on whichever kingdom is convenient. Darius stood amid the captured wagons, face carved from stone. Ilera watched him process what this meant, the scope of the conspiracy, its systematic nature, the years of manipulation both kingdoms had endured. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet but absolute. We need a public trial. Not in my capital or yours, somewhere neutral where citizens from both kingdoms can witness the evidence. A trial that's too public to suppress, with too many witnesses to silence. Your council will never agree, Marcus warned. Neither will hers. They'll demand you execute her, and bury this before it spreads. I know. Darius looked at Ilera across the scattered cargo. The mate bond hummed between them, stronger now after days of working together, of saving each other's lives, of building trust in circumstances designed to destroy it. Which is why I'm not asking permission. That night, alone in his command tent reviewing strategy, Darius finally voiced what they'd both been avoiding. The bond is getting stronger. Alara looked up from the documents she'd been cross-referencing. They'd been working in comfortable silence for hours, but she'd felt it too. The increasing difficulty of being apart, the way her attention kept drifting to him, the warmth that spread through her chest whenever he was near. I know. My wolf wants to claim you.
Properly.
Complete the bond. He didn't look at her, keeping his gaze fixed on the map. It's taking more effort every day to maintain distance. Would that be so terrible? The words escaped before she could stop them. His head snapped up, golden eyes fierce. You're asking if I want to bond myself permanently to someone both our kingdoms want dead? Someone I met because I nearly killed her on a battlefield? Yes, Alara. Under any other circumstances, I would claim you without hesitation. But these aren't other circumstances. No, she agreed quietly. They're not. But the bond doesn't care about convenient timing. The bond is going to get us both killed if we can't think past it. But even as he said it, he moved closer, drawn by the same magnetic pull she felt. We need to focus on survival first. Justice second. Everything else is what makes survival worth it, she interrupted. She stood, closing the distance between them until they were inches apart. I'm not asking you to abandon duty. I'm saying maybe duty and the bond don't have to be enemies. Maybe exposing the conspiracy is what serves both our kingdoms best. His hand rose almost involuntarily, cupping her face with a gentleness that contradicted his warrior's calluses. And if we fail? If the trial goes wrong, and they execute us both, then at least we'll have tried. She leaned into his touch, letting herself feel the connection without fear for the first time since the mate bond struck. At least we'll have been honest about what matters. He kissed her then, not gently, but with the desperate intensity of someone who'd been fighting inevitability and finally surrendered. The mate bond flared bright and fierce between them, sealing something that words couldn't adequately express. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, Darius rested his forehead against hers. We demand the public trial. Border location, representatives from both kingdoms, full evidence presentation. And if they refuse? We present it anyway, Alara finished. Take it directly to the people. Force accountability through public pressure if the councils won't act. It was dangerous. Possibly suicidal. But it was also the only path forward that didn't require them to abandon truth or each other. And neither of them was willing to do that anymore. The border trial was agreed upon within a week, though not for the reasons Darius and Alara had hoped. Both kingdoms' councils accepted because they believed they could control the narrative, her father's advisors confident they could discredit the documents as forgeries, Darius's council certain they could frame Alara as an infiltrator whose testimony held no weight. Neither side anticipated that the accused would present a united front with evidence implicating both kingdoms equally. The location chosen was an ancient stone amphitheater built generations ago to host diplomatic negotiations, now overgrown with vines and neglect. Neutral ground where neither kingdom held advantage. Messengers had been sent to every region announcing the trial, a public accounting of accusations serious enough to threaten the fragile peace both populations desperately wanted. Thousands would attend. There would be no suppressing what happened there, which meant assassins would have countless opportunities amid the crowds. Alara spent the days before the trial organizing evidence with methodical precision, arranging documents chronologically, cross-referencing incidents between kingdoms, building an irrefutable narrative of systematic manipulation. She worked alongside Darius and Marcus. The three of them holed up in the command tent reviewing testimony from captured mercenaries, examining the dual-marked supply wagons, preparing for every argument the councils might raise. On the fourth day, a messenger arrived bearing her father's personal seal. Alara broke it with trembling hands, unsure what to expect. Condemnation, threats, demands for her return. What she found instead broke something inside her chest. Alara, my daughter. I have been a fool. When your disappearance was discovered, when Captain Theron returned with reports of finding you in enemy camps, I demanded explanations from my council. They claimed you'd been manipulated, possibly enchanted. But I pushed harder, and the cracks in their stories began to show. I have spent these past days reviewing records I had trusted others to maintain. I found discrepancies, unexplained expenses, contracts awarded to the same families repeatedly. And I found correspondence hidden but not well enough that confirms what you discovered. They have been using me, using my grief over the war, my desire to protect our people, to justify atrocities I never would have authorized had I known the truth. I do not expect your forgiveness. I am complicit through ignorance, and that is its own form of guilt. But know this, I will testify at the trial if you need me. I will stand before both kingdoms and admit I was manipulated if it helps expose those who profited from our suffering. Your father, who failed you but still loves you. Alara read the letter 3 times before she could speak. When she finally looked up, Darius was watching her with careful attention. He knows, she said quietly. My father knows about the conspiracy. He's offering to testify. Will he actually appear, or will his counsel prevent him? Darius's question held no judgment, just tactical assessment. He'll come. Alara folded the letter carefully. He's many things, but once he commits to something, he follows through. It's why they were able to manipulate him for so long. He trusted absolutely, never questioning those he'd given his loyalty to. Darius nodded slowly, then returned to the document he'd been examining. His expression had gone carefully neutral, but she caught the tension in his shoulders. My head advisor resigned yesterday. Alara looked up sharply. Resigned? Claimed health issues. Left the capital before I could return to question him. Darius's voice was flat. I had Marcus investigate his financial records. The man owns property in 3 kingdoms, has contracts with 7 different military suppliers, and somehow accumulated wealth far beyond what his position should have provided. He's been sabotaging peace negotiations since before I took the throne. Subtle delays, misplaced correspondence, accidental, scheduling conflicts that prevented agreements from finalizing. He knew you were getting too close to the truth. And now he's in the wind, probably with enough money to live comfortably wherever he's fled. Darius set down the document with controlled force. So we'll face the trial without testimony from the chief architects of the conspiracy. Just their underlings and the evidence we've gathered. It will have to be enough. Alara moved to stand beside him, studying the organized stacks of evidence that represented weeks of work. Because it's all we have. The night before the trial arrived, too quickly. Guards had been tripled around their camp, trusted soldiers who'd proven loyal through the assassination attempts. Marcus had positioned scouts in widening circles, watching for threats. Every precaution had been taken, every contingency planned for. There was nothing left to do but wait for dawn and whatever came with it. Alara found Darius standing outside his tent, staring at the distant lights of both kingdoms' camps flanking the amphitheater. The mate bond pulled her toward him with irresistible insistence, stronger now after weeks of working together, of building trust and partnership beneath the political disaster. Can't sleep either? She kept her voice low, thinking about tomorrow. He didn't turn, but his posture shifted slightly toward her, unconscious acknowledgement of her presence. About all the ways it could go wrong. All the variables we can't control. We've prepared for everything we can. She stood beside him, close enough to feel his warmth. The rest is up to fate. I don't like trusting fate. His mouth quirked in something that wasn't quite a smile. I prefer strategy and planning. Then plan for this. Alara turned to face him fully. If the trial succeeds, we'll have exposed the conspiracy and potentially ended a war. If it fails, at least one of us might survive to continue fighting. But either way, we face it together. Darius finally looked at her, golden eyes intense in the darkness. And if we both die tomorrow? Then we die knowing we tried to do something that mattered. She reached for his hand, lacing their fingers together. The mate bond sang at the contact, warm and fierce. But I'd rather not die without. She didn't get to finish. Darius pulled her against him, kissing her with the desperate hunger of someone who'd been restraining himself for weeks and finally stopped fighting. The mate bond flared between them, demanding completion, demanding they claim each other fully before fate could tear them apart. Inside, he managed against her mouth. Not where guards can see. They barely made it into his tent before clothes started coming off, hands finding skin with urgent need. This wasn't gentle or uncertain. It was claiming possession, two people who'd fought against inevitability and finally surrendered completely. When Darius finally entered her, when their bodies joined as thoroughly as their souls had been joined since that battlefield, the mate bond completed with a force that stole breath from both of them. Alara felt its seal through every cell, not just physical pleasure, though that was overwhelming enough, but the absolute certainty of rightness. This person, this soul, this connection. Whatever else happened, whoever tried to tear them apart, the bond was permanent now. Unbreakable. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the darkness, heartbeats gradually slowing to normal rhythm. Darius traced patterns on her bare shoulder, his touch gentle now where it had been fierce minutes before. "Promise me something," he said quietly.
Anything.
"If I die tomorrow and you survive, don't stop. Don't let grief silence you. Take the evidence, present it however you can. Make them hear the truth." His hand stilled against her skin. "Promise me my death won't be meaningless. Only if you promise the same." Alara shifted to look at him directly. "If I die and you survive, you expose the conspiracy no matter what your council demands. You make sure this matters." "I promise." He kissed her forehead, her cheeks, her lips. "Though I'd prefer we both survive." "Agreed." She settled back against his chest, listening to his heartbeat. "But either way, we made our choice. Truth over safety. Justice over silence. That has to count for something." They fell asleep like that, wrapped in each other, and the mate bond that now connected them permanently. Outside, guards maintained their watch. In the distance, both kingdoms' camps prepared for tomorrow's trial. And somewhere in the darkness, assassins likely made their own preparations, calculating how to silence the two people who threatened decades of profitable corruption. But for these few hours, Alara and Darius had peace. They had each other, and they had the certainty that whatever tomorrow brought, they would face it together, bound by fate, sealed by choice, and willing to die for a truth that might finally set both their kingdoms free. The amphitheater filled before dawn, thousands of people claiming positions on ancient stone terraces that hadn't seen such crowds in generations. Citizens from both kingdoms came, farmers and merchants, soldiers and nobles, families who'd lost loved ones to the war and wanted answers about why the dying never stopped. They filled the space with tension so thick it felt physical. Two populations separated by generations of propaganda now forced to sit across from each other and confront uncomfortable truths. Alara stood in the center arena, acutely aware of every eye upon her. She wore simple clothing, no armor, no weapons, nothing that might suggest military threat. Just a woman holding documents that could topple governments. Beside her, Darius stood in formal attire that marked him as royalty, but not warrior, presenting himself as king rather than combatant. Marcus flanked them, carrying additional evidence organized for presentation. On the raised platform surrounding the arena sat both kingdoms' representatives. Her father had come, looking decades older than when she'd last seen him, flanked by council members whose expressions ranged from confident dismissal to barely concealed hostility. Darius's regent council occupied the opposite platform, his advisors maintaining careful neutrality that fooled no one paying attention. A herald stepped forward, voice magically amplified to reach the entire gathering. This tribunal convenes to address accusations of conspiracy, false flag operations, and systematic manipulation of conflict between our kingdoms. Lady Alara and King Darius will present evidence. Representatives from both councils will respond. Let truth guide our judgment. Alara began simply, holding up the first document. 3 weeks ago, I discovered this in my father's private study. Operation Millbrook. orders for our kingdom soldiers to attack our own border village while dressed in Fenrath uniforms, blame the massacre on King Darius's forces, and use the incident to justify breaking our betrothal treaty. Her voice carried across stone, clear and unwavering. I have the original signed orders, budget allocations for the operation, and testimony from soldiers who were told to participate. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. On the platform, her father's face had gone gray. His head advisor, Lord Ashford, stood abruptly. Forgeries. Enemy propaganda designed to. Then explain these. Darius stepped forward, holding his own documents. Corresponding incidents in my kingdom. Attacks blamed on Lady Alara's forces that match no authorized military operations. Supply disruptions that benefited specific contractors. Peace negotiations sabotaged through accidental miscommunications. He looked directly at his own council members. Contractors whose family connections lead directly to council advisors. Marcus presented next, laying out the evidence methodically. The captured supply wagons with dual insignias. Testimony from mercenaries who'd been paid by both kingdoms' conspirators to stage attacks. Financial records showing council members accumulating wealth far beyond their official positions. Each piece built on the previous, creating a narrative too detailed and interconnected to dismiss as simple forgery. The crowd's mood shifted. Alara watched it happen, initial skepticism giving way to dawning horror as citizens from both kingdoms recognized patterns in incidents they'd lived through. A woman stood in the Fenrath section, voice shaking. My village was attacked 5 years ago. They said it was Aristan raiders. Are you saying it was a lie? Before anyone could answer, a man from Alara's kingdom called out. Our grain warehouses burned. We starved that winter. You're telling me our own council did that? The amphitheater erupted in voices, angry, confused, demanding answers. The council members on their platforms shifted uncomfortably. Lord Ashford's confidence had cracked, replaced by something closer to panic. These accusations require investigation, not, he started. Investigation. Alara's father stood, and the crowd quieted to hear him. I have spent the past week investigating, Lord Ashford. I found your private correspondence, your hidden accounts, your deals with contractors who profited from every delay in peace negotiations. His voice broke. You used me. Used my trust, my grief, my desire to protect our people, to justify atrocities I never would have authorized. Your Majesty, you're not well. You've been under strain. Lord Ashford's attempt to deflect died as armed guards moved to block his exit. Not assassins. These were loyal soldiers Marcus had positioned specifically to prevent escape. That's when the real assassin struck. The first crossbow bolt came from the crowd, aimed at Alara's chest. Darius moved with supernatural speed, pulling her aside as the bolt buried itself in stone where she'd been standing. Chaos erupted instantly. Hired killers hidden among citizens revealed themselves, weapons appearing from beneath cloaks. They targeted Alara, Darius, and Marcus simultaneously, professional coordination designed to eliminate all three before truth could be fully established. Loyal soldiers engaged immediately, but the assassins had positioned themselves well. Citizens screamed, scrambling for exits that quickly became bottlenecked. Alara saw a child nearly trampled, and something inside her snapped. She shifted without thinking, bones breaking and reforming, human shape giving way to wolf in seconds that felt like agony and relief simultaneously. Her wolf form was smaller than Darius's, but faster, golden fur distinctive even in chaos. She leaped over panicking citizens, intercepting an assassin who'd drawn a blade to strike at a fleeing family. Her jaws closed on his wrist with bone-crushing force. He screamed, dropping the weapon. Beside her, Darius shifted as well, a massive wolf with dark fur and eyes that burned with alpha dominance. The mate bond sang between them even in wolf form, allowing communication beyond words. They moved as one unit, protecting civilians while loyal soldiers engaged the assassins throughout the amphitheater. An assassin targeted Marcus, blade aimed for his throat. Alara intercepted, taking the strike across her shoulder instead. Pain blazed, but her werewolf healing was already working. Darius tore the assassin's throat out before he could strike again, brutal and efficient. The fight spread across the entire amphitheater. Corrupted guards who'd been paid to look the other way now revealed themselves, clashing with loyalists in vicious combat. But the conspirators had miscalculated. They'd assumed killing Alara and Darius would silence the truth. Instead, their assassination attempt in full public view proved everything the evidence had claimed. Lord Ashford tried to flee during the chaos, pushing through crowds toward a service exit. Alara saw him, felt Darius's attention shift the same direction through the mate bond. They moved in perfect synchronization, cutting off his escape route, herding him back toward the center arena, where thousands could witness what came next. He backed against a pillar, trapped between two massive wolves whose eyes held human intelligence and fury. Behind them, loyal soldiers had subdued or killed most of the assassins. The crowd's panic was subsiding into horrified comprehension of what they'd just witnessed, their own councils attempting murder to silence truth. "Shift back," Marcus commanded, breathing hard from his own fight. "We need his confession, not his corpse." Alara shifted first, bones reforming painfully, standing naked until someone threw her a cloak. Darius shifted beside her, accepting clothing from a soldier. They faced Lord Ashford together, united in purpose and bond. "Confess." Darius's voice carried across the amphitheater. "Tell them what you did. All of it." You can't prove." Lord Ashford's gaze darted around, seeking escape that didn't exist. "We already proved it." Alara gestured at the scattered evidence, the captured assassins, the crowd of witnesses. "You just tried to murder us in front of thousands. Your only choice now is whether you confess or whether we let them decide your guilt based on what they've seen." The crowd's mood had turned murderous. Citizens from both kingdoms were shouting for blood, for justice, for answers about loved ones lost to manufactured conflicts. Lord Ashford seemed to recognize that his options had narrowed to confession or being torn apart by a mob. "It was profitable," he said finally, voice barely audible. "The war. The contracts. Every delay in peace negotiations meant more funding, more weapons orders, more opportunities. We weren't the only ones." He gestured at Darius's platform where several council members were being restrained. "Both kingdoms. Coordinated. Keep the war going, keep the money flowing. That's all it was. That's all." Alara's father had descended to the arena floor, face twisted with anguish and rage. "You killed thousands. Destroyed families. Turned me into a monster who authorized massacres of my own people. For profit." Lord Ashford had no answer that would satisfy. Around the amphitheater, the remaining conspirators were being arrested or had already fallen to loyalist soldiers. The truth was out, undeniable and witnessed by thousands who had spread it further. The conspiracy had been exposed. The war built on lies was collapsing. And Alara and Darius stood at the center of it, alive despite everything, bound by fate and sealed by choice, having risked everything for truth and somehow survived to see justice begin. The executions were held at dawn, witnessed by representatives from both kingdoms who demanded accountability for decades of manipulation. Lord Ashford died first, followed by 9 other council members whose involvement in the conspiracy had been proven beyond doubt through financial records and testimony from captured mercenaries. Alara didn't attend. She'd seen enough death on battlefields to last a lifetime. But she received reports of how the crowds had gathered in silence, watching justice delivered to those who'd profited from their suffering. Her father came to see her 3 days after the trial, looking like a man who'd aged a decade in weeks. They met in neutral territory, a small garden between the two kingdoms' encampments where peace negotiations were already beginning. He stood before her with shoulders bowed, the weight of his failures visible in every line of his face. "I have decided to abdicate," he said without preamble. "The council, what remains of it, agrees the transition should happen immediately. You'll take the throne." Alara had expected this, but hearing it still struck with physical force. "Father, I was complicit through ignorance." His voice was steady despite the pain in his eyes. "I trusted when I should have questioned. I authorized actions without investigating their necessity. Thousands died because I was too comfortable in my assumptions, too willing to believe advisors who told me what I wanted to hear. He finally met her gaze. You risked everything to expose the truth. You deserve to lead in ways I never did. You were manipulated by people you had every reason to trust. She kept her voice gentle. That doesn't erase your responsibility, but it doesn't make you irredeemable either. Perhaps not irredeemable. He smiled sadly. But I am broken, Alara. I see my wife's face in my nightmares. She died believing I was protecting our kingdom, never knowing I'd become the monster our enemies claimed. I cannot continue ruling while carrying that knowledge. Let me step aside. Let you and Darius build something better from the ruins we created. Alara embraced him, feeling him tremble against her. Then build it with us. Not as king, but as advisor. As someone who learned from terrible mistakes and can help others avoid them. He pulled back, searching her face. You would trust me with that? I would trust you to remember what happens when leaders stop questioning their advisors. That's a lesson worth preserving. She squeezed his hands. Stay. Help us establish transparency councils, citizen oversight, systems that prevent this from happening again. Your redemption doesn't require retreat, Father. It requires facing what happened and working to ensure it never repeats. The formal abdication occurred a week later in a ceremony attended by both kingdom citizens. Her father placed the crown on Alara's head himself, voice breaking as he publicly confessed his failures and asked forgiveness from people he'd inadvertently harmed. The crowd's response was mixed. Some shouted anger, others offered unexpected sympathy. But most simply watched in silence, processing the unprecedented sight of a king admitting fallibility and choosing accountability over pride. Darius's kingdom responded differently to their revelation. His council had included conspirators, yes, but he'd exposed them himself rather than being exposed by others. His people celebrated him for choosing truth over political convenience, for risking the alliance to ensure justice. When he returned to his capital, crowds lined the streets, not in anger but in relief that their king had proven trustworthy even when tested by impossible circumstances. The Joint Tribunal began its work immediately, a body composed of citizens from both kingdoms, tasked with investigating every suspicious incident from the past 3 decades. They heard testimony from families who'd lost loved ones to manufactured attacks. They examined financial records to trace which contractors had profited. They identified burial sites where victims of false flag operations had been hastily hidden. The work was painful and slow, but necessary. Restitution came in multiple forms. Families received financial compensation, though no amount of money could replace lost loved ones. Public memorials were erected in villages that had been destroyed, acknowledging that the attacks had been orchestrated rather than acts of legitimate war. And most importantly, the truth was recorded, comprehensive documentation of the conspiracy, preserved in public archives where future generations could learn from past failures. 3 months after the trial, preparations began for a wedding that would unite 2 kingdoms not through political convenience, but through genuine partnership forged in shared trauma and mutual respect. The ceremony took place at the border amphitheater, where truth had nearly cost them their lives. But now the ancient stone had been cleaned and restored, decorated with flowers from both kingdoms woven together in patterns that symbolized unity rather than division. Thousands attended again, but this time in celebration rather than confrontation. Alara wore white silk embroidered with golden wolves, her blonde hair adorned with flowers that had once grown only in Darius's kingdom. Darius wore formal attire incorporating design elements from her kingdom's traditions, his dark hair braided according to customs he'd learned specifically for this moment. They met at the center of the amphitheater, the same spot where they'd presented evidence that exposed decades of corruption. The ceremony was conducted by spiritual leaders from both kingdoms, blessings woven together from different traditions into something new. When they spoke their vows, their voices carried across the crowd, promises not just to each other, but to the people watching. Promises of transparency, accountability, leadership earned rather than assumed. When Darius kissed her, When their mate bond flared bright enough that those sensitive to magic claimed they could see it shimmer in the air between them, the crowd erupted in cheers that echoed off stone and spread through both kingdoms like wildfire. This was what peace looked like when built on truth rather than comfortable lies. Messy, complicated, painful to achieve, but real in ways political theater could never accomplish. The celebration lasted 3 days. Citizens from both kingdoms mingled freely, sharing food and stories, discovering that the enemies they'd been taught to hate were simply people trying to survive circumstances beyond their control. Friendships formed. Trade agreements were discussed. Families separated by arbitrary borders began planning reunions. On the final day, Alara and Darius stood before the assembled crowds to address both kingdoms jointly. Her father watched from the front row, no longer wearing a crown but present nonetheless, supporting the daughter he'd nearly lost to his own failures. Peace built on lies is just a pause before the next war, Alara began, her voice steady and clear. We learned that the hard way. Our kingdoms were kept in conflict for decades because powerful people profited from our fear and anger. They counted on us never questioning the narratives we were fed, never looking past propaganda to see the humanity in those we were told to hate. Truth is harder, Darius continued. It requires us to question authority, to demand accountability, to accept uncomfortable realities about systems we trusted. It means admitting when we were wrong, when we were manipulated, when our certainties were built on deliberate deception. But truth is also what makes lasting peace possible, Alara said. Because peace built on honesty can withstand scrutiny. It doesn't require us to ignore atrocities or pretend the past didn't happen. Instead, it demands we face what happened, hold people accountable, and build systems that prevent repetition. We're establishing transparency councils, Darius announced. Citizen oversight committees with authority to investigate government actions and demand evidence for military operations. No more closed-door decisions that send soldiers to die for manufactured conflicts. No more convenient attacks that justify profitable policies. We're opening diplomatic channels that were closed for generations, Alara added. Trade, cultural exchange, joint infrastructure projects. We're choosing cooperation over competition, building connections that make future conflict less profitable for those who might try to manipulate us again. This won't be easy, they said together, voices harmonizing. There will be setbacks. People will resist change. Old hatreds don't disappear overnight. But we're committed to building something better, a peace that our children can trust because it's founded on truth rather than convenient fictions. The crowd's response was thunderous, not universal approval because such things never were, but genuine hope. Hope that maybe this time, finally, the peace would hold. That maybe the sacrifices made had purchased something worth keeping. Afterward, as the crowds dispersed and the celebration wound down, Alara found her father standing alone near the memorial stone erected for victims of the conspiracy. "Thank you," he said quietly, "for letting me stay. For believing redemption was possible." "We all made choices based on incomplete information," Alara replied, standing beside him. "The difference is what we do after learning the truth. You chose accountability over pride. That matters." He nodded, touching the memorial stone gently. "I'll spend whatever time I have left ensuring this never happens again. It won't erase what was done, but perhaps it will honor those we lost. That's all any of us can do." She linked her arm through his. "Build something better from the ruins. Make their deaths mean something by preventing future ones." As sunset painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Alara and Darius stood together at the border that was becoming less a division and more a meeting point. The mate bond hummed contentedly between them, satisfied by their survival and the beginning of something neither kingdom had experienced in generations: genuine peace, hard-won, and honestly built. It wouldn't be perfect. Peace never was. But it would be real. And that made all the difference.